Okay, okay, dear friends, great honor, great pleasure to introduce one more time Kristіан Dolл, kind of extra pleasure. Kristіan teaches sociology and anthropology in the University of North Carolina, and he conducted extensive field research in South Sudan, a country which has experienced and is experiencing now a lot of conflicts. So it's extremely important for us to study other nations' experiences, nations going through conflict, nations attempting recovery. It's also important for us in the light of our educational program, focusing on conflict resolution, mediation, social data analysis, historical sociology of global conflict, structural-oriented sociology. Nevertheless, having said all that, we have always been paying attention to meticulous, painstaking research work, data collection, and research methods. And Kristіan is going to share his unique experience with us. Thank you, and without further ado, would like to give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's a real honor and pleasure to get to talk to you all. And I'll, as Pablo so generously said, I did some research in South Sudan. So I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit today about, or in this talk, about my research specifically. And then in another talk, I'll talk a little bit more about my my methodology. Are you able to see my my slides there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes, we had a little technical difficulty, so I'm so happy to get to talk to you. So what I'll do today, and you know what's so great about anthropology, it gives us this opportunity. What I love about anthropology and social scientific research is it gives us an opportunity not only to kind of get an in-depth knowledge of particular places, but also to find ways to think across very different contexts in particular ways. So I'm very keen to have your thoughts and to hear your thoughts about the dynamics I'll talk about in South Sudan in relation to all of your work and thinking ongoing about conflict and conflict resolution and your particular expertise. So I've called this talk "How Thong Ping Became Juba Nabari," a title that will hopefully make sense by the time I'm finished. Naming and placemaking in urban South Sudan. As Pablo said, I'm Kristіан Dolл. I'm cultural anthropologist in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at North Carolina State University. Before I get into the substance of my talk, which I should let you know is taken from an article I've published, and then also is a chapter of my book that should be coming out sometime next year, hopefully, in which I think about South Sudanese independence really as a process of future making and imagining the future and thinking through what could be, what is becoming, and as an open-ended process rather than thinking of it as a failed or stalled process, as a lot of the narratives around South Sudan and also African political context in general are framed under notions of failure, of unevenness, of lacking, of lack, and of in a negative terms. That South Sudan I'm thinking about in terms of drawing from the conversations I had with people there. I'm thinking about it in terms of becoming an expectation, and especially how people are thinking about that within in urban context. So in South Sudan, that's Juba. So that's where I spent the majority of my time doing my research in Juba from 2012, which was a year after South Sudan became independent, through 2015, and I've been kind of writing up that field work ever since. So some context, here's South Sudan. South Sudan became independent from Sudan. So you can see here's the kind of regional context and some historical context. There was preceding South Sudan's independence, there was sort of a series of colonialisms. It was Sudan as a whole was under the Ottoman Empire. Then it was under something called the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium, which was really the British colonial order, but it was a partnership with the Egyptian government at the time. And it was under this period, under the British Empire, that the North and the South were really governed as two separate entities. And governance looked quite different. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but that gives you the context for South Sudan's independence. In 1956, Sudan itself became independent, but the government was largely controlled by a northern elite, really a small class of people, many of whom had been trained under the colonial administration, and had the skills and sort of knowledge to be running a centralized government. So the government was handed over quite quickly there. But people outside of that kind of elite group were not represented in the government to follow, especially South Sudan, or what was then Southern Sudan. So while we can think of the conflict, the situation that preceded South Sudan's independence as a North-South conflict, it might actually make much more sense to think about it as a center-periphery conflict within the country, because people in Sudan, or what what was then Northern Sudan, were also not really much represented by this sort of the government that emerged. So because of those kind of failed kind of like broken promises around inclusion of the South and changing things, and the economic situation being quite distinct in the South, there were two Sudanese civil wars and two rebel movements. The first war lasted from 1963 to 1972. The second one, 1983 to 2005. The conflict 1983 to 2005, importantly, was worsened by infighting between rebel factions. So that war eventually ends in 2005 with the promise of a referendum on secession that happens in 2011. And in 2011, South Sudan gains its independence. So for my purposes and what I'll talk about today, it's important to keep in mind that the capital city of Juba, which became the capital, was the capital in the interim period, but became the national capital after independence. It's quite small, and it became the national capital more by default of being sort of the major economic center than by some real planning or its logistical capacity to be the government center in a lot of ways. And there was quite rapid growth in Juba between in 2005 when the war ended and in 2011 after independence, right? So a lot of long-standing residents in Juba had legal claims on land, but these laws are like quite in flux in terms of what they mean. They were written for a country that no longer existed, right? In a way, Southern Sudan was part of a larger country. Now it was South Sudan. So there were some issues and with the kind of meanings of ownership of land within Juba, but also there's this influx of new residents. So that's people coming from throughout South Sudan and the diaspora, people who are war veterans who are coming, really wanting to make a life in the capital, newly empowered government leaders and workers, a lot of entrepreneurs from neighboring countries, especially Kenya, Uganda, Eritrea, Ethiopia, all of which had fairly good relationships with South Sudan. And of course, international aid workers and employees of the new embassies that are established. So a lot of people looking for home, bringing a lot of opportunities, a lot of money, but that causes, a great deal of sort of tension in the city because who owns land and what it means changes a lot. So that's kind of the context for what I'll talk about. So there's competition over space, but also involved with this competition over space is like defining and controlling and owning the capital and the country. So just a little bit more context. So here's I'm showing you within the British colonial administration. Here's where Sudan was. You can see how it's kind of the bridge between the British Empire's territories in Eastern Africa and the Suez Canal, right? So it was quite an important strategic and geographic location for them to have control over. So that's quite important. The Nile runs through Sudan, right up through Egypt, from reaching from Uganda all the way up, right? So you have this important trade route there. Here's a picture of the Governor General of Sudan, who had pretty fairly extensive autonomy to control the area. You can see he has a lot of Northern Sudanese workers who worked in his office, his capacity at the time. On the other hand, in South Sudan, there was not much investment in a lot of ways, and Christian missionaries from Europe were largely running the schools. So to the extent that someone got an education, it was not because of the central government or the colonial government. It was really because of these independent mission spheres. So there was a disparity there. Here's a picture of the rebels after the first war ends. This is the Anyanya movement. So this is the Sudanese Civil War, the first Sudanese Civil War. And this is the second Sudanese Civil War was fought by the Sudan People's Liberation Army / movement. You can see the two men in the center there, the one with the red hat, that's Salva Kiir Mayardit, becomes the president of South Sudan, and next to him, the kind of slightly shorter gentleman is John Garang, who's kind of the founding father of South Sudan, had led this movement, dies shortly after the war ends, tragically. And here's a picture of previous head of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, who was deposed a few years ago, and John Garang, the head of the Sudan People's Liberation Army. This is after the second Sudanese Civil War ends, right? And then here, you can see, I didn't take these pictures. I was not there at the South Sudanese Independence Day ceremony, but this is Salva Kiir Mayardit in his kind of famous Stetson hat, as Pablo, you mentioned when we were talking before we started, which was actually a gift from George W. Bush, as far as I understand. But here he is holding up the Constitution of South Sudan on South Sudanese Independence Day in 2011. So that's some broad context. Hopefully that wasn't too quick or too long. I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for what I'll talk about because it's kind of important for understanding the dynamics I'm talking about. This is another picture that gives you a bit of a sense of what has been happening in South Sudan since then. After 2011 and in 2013 until about 2018, there was a pretty violent civil war that played out in South Sudan. It was quite regionally isolated at moments, and it largely was factions, people who were in the government formed a rebel movement, who were previously in the government formed a rebel movement to fight against the government. This is a picture I took when I was flying into South Sudan at one point of a UN protection of civilian camp that was set up in Juba, in the capital, outside on kind of the outskirts. And this was set up for people who had been targeted as potential rebels or had been seen as potential rebels of the government. There was sort of ethnic targeting based on a kind of presumption of people being ethnically affiliated with the movement, although that was a kind of a flattening of what the dynamics actually were. But this kind of gives you a little bit of also a sense of the fact that the city itself was a site of fighting and fear and uncertainty as well. So that's a little bit of a context. So I won't be talking so much directly about the conflict itself, so much as like what it looked like in Juba and the way in which people are trying to sort of think about and enact their hopes for the place and their place within the city and therefore within the country as a result of based on their own experience and history. So that's where I'll with that long prologue, that's where I'd like to what I'd like to talk about today. So I'll talk a little bit about this picture here. You see, I think you'll kind of get a sense for what this is, and I'm going to read you a little bit of an ethnographic series of vignettes to talk about Juba and South Sudan, Juba and kind of its broader the broader things happening in Juba in relation to South Sudan more broadly. So the bottom of a large, steep road in Juba, South Sudan, a prominent piece of land at the corner of a busy intersection was filled with rubble. Merchandise on sale the day before was now sitting among broken bricks and cracked blocks of cement, proof the shop owners had not seen this coming. Gone were two small, well-stocked shops selling canned groceries and airtime, a narrow shop offering photocopies, printing services, and haircuts, and a restaurant serving South Sudanese dishes that filled up each time it blasted American movies on its satellite TV feed. Situated as it was at a prominent intersection and a short walk from some of the largest NGO compounds, hotels, and offices in the city, and the embassy of the EU and for the United States, the strip was sure to be redeveloped quickly. In the meantime, the demolition had already been turned a profit. Two small shops, one selling bread and the other airtime, were swiftly built from the larger metal sheets abandoned after the demolition. So that's kind of what you can see here. The stores were victims of one of the many land disputes in this growing and highly desirable neighborhood in which they once stood. The speed with which the demolition was carried out and the lack of action by the former shop owners to reverse this decision similarly reflect the risk one takes in signing any lease in Juba and just how valuable land has become in the world's newest capital city. The neighborhood where the demolition took place and its rapid growth is emblematic of the sense of opportunity on offer following the rapid influx of people and money into post-independence Juba, even amidst the uncertain consequences of the still ongoing conflict. The destruction of these premises showed that any claim to any piece of land within the city, irrespective of any leases or deals made with the occupants by previous claimants, would be acted upon with a quick and total demolition. It is in this interplay between the sense of open-ended potential and short-term profit that competing narratives about the past and present of this neighborhood have taken hold. These narratives are epitomized by two different names given to the neighborhood where the demolition occurred. One, in the Dinka language, is Thongping, meaning the same place. The other is Juba Nabari, from the Bari language, meaning the Juba of the Bari people. In what follows, I ground these names in personal histories that exemplify their claims both upon urban space and, through Juba, upon the South Sudanese state. So what I'd like to offer today is a sense of the way that Juba is not a single place, but is multiple. I'll show how placemaking Juba asserts particular histories and meanings to Juba, and in doing so claims on the city and through the city onto the state in its future. In offering several distinct makings of Juba, I aim to disrupt the singular and overdetermined narrative of failed statehood and perpetual conflict, and instead show how Juba exists as a multiplicity of concurrent experiences and expectations, and how these placemakings ultimately become ways of materializing distinct futures. So that video was just showing you a little bit of what Juba looks like. Maybe it looked different from what you might expect. Some larger roads, some smaller roads, and it's been growing quite rapidly. And you can see that there's kind of a lot going on in the city. So in 2015, I interviewed an elder named John in front of his large tukul, or grass roof house, in a neighborhood of Juba called High Gabat, named for the Ministry of Forestry that was once there. John was close to 80, and he had a sharp memory of the decades he had lived in and out of Juba. He attributed his memory to the daily walks that he took and his spurning of alcohol throughout his life. John told me his involved story of displacement and movement. In the mid-1960s, floods in the swampy northeastern region of South Sudan forced John and many others out of their homes and ultimately to Juba. He and the other new arrivals built homes and grazed their cattle in land John described as, quote, bush and forest. It became the site for lively community events such as wrestling matches and dancing, and John said it felt like the centers of villages and towns outside of the city, like where he had come from. The displaced Dinkas were unhappy to have left behind their homes, but as they grew comfortable, raised new crops, and grazed their cattle, they began saying this new place in Juba was just as good as the land they had left behind. This led them to give their new home the name Dongping, which is Dinka for the same place. So Dong, the same, Pin is like place or ground. In 1972, the first Sudanese civil war ended, and the newly empowered southern government, made up of former rebels, began implementing their reform agenda. One of these was a plan called Kokora, which is the Bari word meaning share or divide. Increasingly implemented through the early 1980s, the policy sought to decentralize the government, but its main tenet was that all South Sudanese needed to return to their home region. In Juba, for many people, Kokora is remembered as a harsh regulation and a confining of cattle keeping within Juba. Dinkas, John, and many others who had come to Juba seeking shelter were eventually forced to leave Juba, a place where they'd built several tukels for their wives and children. Kokora's mandate of returning to one's region of origin left displaced Jubas like people like John, not back to villages they no longer knew, but into larger towns within the region. Finding few opportunities for work upon returning to these towns, John moved again, this time to Khartoum in the north, eventually sending his children to school in Kenya when the Second Sudanese Civil War began in 1983. When the Second Civil War ended in 2005, John, like many, saw a chance to return to Juba. The city was filling up with veterans and returnees from around the world, and John recognized only a few of his old neighbors when he came back. Thongping had suddenly become a first-class area, and John saw that the majority of land he used to live in was owned or leased by Ugandans or Equatorians, that is, South Sudanese from that region. Many of John's friends had pleaded to the state and local authorities for land, telling them that though they hadn't been born there, they had buried parents and children there, making them as linked to this land and have as much of a claim to the city as anyone else. So after speaking with John, my friend McQuay and I walked along one of Thongping's main roads, and McQuay gestured around us. Building on John's story, he told me how he had come here in 2006. And then the grass had reached his waist, and it was unsafe to cross into at night. As we made our way up the road, past the demolished building I mentioned in the opening, we passed 10-story hotels and office buildings, large estates owned by diplomats, SPLA commanders, home offices for Save the Children and other NGOs, and eventually we reached the EU and the US embassies. Each of these had more imposing walls and securities than the last. It was a far cry from the place the Dinka population had left behind during the Kokora period, and not the well-fortified garrison town that the SPLA, the rebels in the Second Civil War, had never managed to penetrate during 1983 and 2005. During the time John and his community had been gone, the unoccupied land had turned into agricultural fields, and one of the most common crops that continued to be cultivated after its inhabitants left was groundnuts, also known as peanuts. In fact, the place that had been called the same place, or Thongping, once it was emptied of its relocated inhabitants, acquired a new name, which meant groundnut in the Dinka and the Nuer language. So Thong meaning nut, and Pin still meaning ground or place. So as you may have noticed, this name and its old name are nearly indistinguishable, especially because their distinction primarily relies on a tonal difference, a breathier O, a linguistic minimal pair, nearly indecipherable for non-native speakers, further compounded by varied spelling, since a lot of Nilotic languages are primarily oral languages that people don't necessarily always write, and they don't write transcribe consistently always. So this name, Thongping, the new name, groundnut, is one of the two of the most common names you will hear for the place today. The name Thongping, though, tells a distinctly different story than that of John's dual displacement. It suggests eternally vacant farmland sitting just outside the city proper. After the peace agreement in 2005, the town's population swelled, and an area so close to the city center and astride the airport was of too much importance to be occupied by Thongping, or groundnuts, alone. Former rebel commanders and coming into the city quickly established large compounds and filled them with extended families who followed them to the city. Meanwhile, official plots were handed over by authorities in the regional government. Many were handed to former or current officials or other long-term residents of Juba. And the more connections one had to these authorities, the easier it was to accomplish this. Often this meant being from a Bari or someone from the region. In this rapid buildup of Tongping, another name came to attached to it. This name reflected autochthonous claims and had long been in use to mark areas that were held off from takeover by past occupants of Juba. This name was Juba Nabari. So Juba Nabari is from a different language, from the Bari language, and it can most simply be translated as Juba of the Bari, or the Bari people's Juba. But many read its implications as far wider. As one non-Bari interlocutor told me, the best translation would actually be all of Juba belongs to the Bari. The name had come into use as far back as the mid-1800s, and at that time it referred to the small town near the garrison being set up over the river by British General Samuel Gordon. As foreign presence in Juba grew, the name continued to mark out the so-called native area reserved and set apart from the homes and offices of colonial administrators from Turkey, from Egypt, from England, and from Northern Sudan. In other words, Juba Nabari had always meant the part of Juba that belonged to the native people of this land, the Bari, while the rest of the town was increasingly owned by foreigners or non-Southerners, whoever came in from outside. Juba Nabari is a name then that has shifted in its referent as Juba has continued to grow and change. Up until 2005, which, as I said, is when the Second Sudanese War ended, it referred to an area along the Nile. After 2005, and more so after independence in 2011, it latched onto the fastest growing section of Juba. As land titles were given out to long-term residents of Juba, mostly Bari speakers or people from the area, a long-standing locution marking ownership and autochthony was valorized for the newly independent urban hub. Before, the marked foreigners in Juba had been Turks, Egyptians, the British, Northern Sudanese, but now the marked outsiders were Southern Sudanese from other regions of the country, usually conflated to the ethnic term the Dinka, a term used loosely to refer to nearly anyone who wasn't obviously from the central Equatoria region, or like the area directly around Juba. The new naming asserts a historical constancy through an erasure. Though people may have taken temporary settlement in Juba in past decades, Juba Nabari seems to suggest, this land has always and still does belong to the Bari. So the life histories recounted to me by people born and raised in Juba, mainly Bari speakers, evoke a different understanding of urban history than those I had recorded from interlocutors like John and like McQuay. In fact, these personal narratives reflected an inverse historical experience. To these Jubans, because the city was a highly controlled garrison during the civil wars had been periods of stability, periods of peace, or of the end of periods in between the wars, during which there was a sudden influx of new arrivals and a shift in political realities, were destabilizing for long-term residents. So my Bari-speaking interlocutors told me about resettling back onto family land after each war-driven movement around the city or away from it, and their experiences of relocation reinforced their sense of being rightly settled back into a home from which they had only temporarily departed. The overarching narrative thread of constant occupancy in Juba contrasted with the stories of forced migration, continual movement, and precarity I'd heard from Jubans like John. So one example is from a woman named Katali, this is her compound I'm showing you here. A middle-aged woman who noted that she had grown up on her grandfather's plot in the Atlabara neighborhood before moving into the Couture section of central Juba in 1993, and then to her current home in 2007. So basically to different neighborhoods in Juba. Katali currently lived in her current place with her 3 grown daughters and with children and their children, and made money selling homemade liquor to neighbors as well as to the students and faculty of Catholic University, which was located near her family's compound. Quote, "When we transferred here, all these places were in the bush. She told me about the area her home was located within now. The compounds that existed were far apart from each other then, a stark contrast to the current grid of walled compounds stretching out for miles that she had seen emerge. The place had been built up and filled in especially quickly in 2008 and 2009, she explained. Echoing a dynamic I'd heard from others, Katale noted that her family had not faced any issues with competing claims to her property, since her father had secured the title papers for the plot before they had moved here. These experiences, reflected to me by Bari speakers, as well as their notion of Juba Nabari itself, all reflect a Juba of continuity, the place where they lived and of which they retained relative autonomy and ownership during the tumultuous years following the end of the Second Civil War and the lead up and aftermath of independence. So Katale and others noted that land conflicts, like those I alluded to in the opening vignette, claimed that the root of these conflicts was the fact that while the Bari have a long-standing legal system for land allocation, quote, Dinka just take land. Remember, Dinka's kind of anyone who's not from the Juba area broadly, without going through the allocation process. Rulings made by a customary ruler or a member of the state or national government that altered a plot's ownership meant that any buildings on the land, no matter how large or recently constructed, had to be demolished. This happened fairly frequently, she noted, although the implementation of such rulings depended on the status of the person occupying the property. In many of these cases, when the new occupants were soldiers or veterans or otherwise well-armed or well-connected people, the landowners were reluctant to push to get their land back. Accountability and the settlement of claims thus remained inconsistent. The conflict and confusion of these dynamics has only been exacerbated by the layering of contradictory laws, described by South Sudanese legal scholar as a pluralist legal system that incorporates parallel systems of statutory and customary courts, which do not consistently handle disputes or share their rulings among each other. Such a situation explains the widely held feeling that only those with money, influence, or the right connections could follow through on their claims or obtain the necessary official paperwork to prove ownership. And that system is thus inconsistent and unfair. So the names Thongping and Juba Nabari offer a glimpse that I would suggest is a layered, multiply experienced and heteroglossic nature of urban life and the ongoing repercussions of alternative subjectivities forged by distinct experiences of war and peace in South Sudan. They assert separate visions of how and by whom the city and the country would be defined and settled going forward. Thongping can best be glossed as a place that moved, but not a name. In the accounts of people like John, it expresses a community creating continuity amidst displacement. The lives and the society that they once had in Bor could be and were recreated in Juba. In tying past community life to a contemporary presence, it asserts a sense that upheaval cannot erase what was built before, for the sense of community lost in relocation could be rebuilt in a location of refuge. Juba Nabari, as a name and as a narrative, represents the inverse. It is a name that has moved, spanning different parts of the city, but is not a singular place. Juba Nabari has shifted its scope depending on the political context and the nature of new occupants. The name thus lays claim to and ascribes ownership of Juba to a perpetual and autochthonous set of owners. These claims have been buttressed by formal processes of allocation in the face of recurrent incursion by outsiders. It is a name that aims to control in the face of surrounding upheaval. This is a picture of an event, kind of like what John was describing, of kind of a cultural event and kind of an ownership of land in Juba recently. So this is me. I'll wrap up with a couple more things. So both names enact distinct experiences of conflict and change, and both equally imagine a South Sudanese and Juban future of predictability and potentiality through the rendering of space. Their continued potency lies not just in this embeddedness within particular subjectivities and experiences, but in their assertion of a broader imaginary of difference and division in South Sudan, a reality that is continually stirred up by conflict. The broader ethnospatial divides and attendant meanings for Juba and South Sudan that they index can be read into other experiences of economic and political precarity. This indicates how much is at stake when it comes to naming and placemaking in the city. In the longer paper, I go into talking about job allocation and senses of sort of economic opportunity in addition to land that come about as a sense of kind of control of the city and having access to it. So following my many conversations with people about the names of Juba neighborhoods and their experiences and memories of the city's continual change, I was increasingly struck by a sign I had frequently passed. It hung outside a small clinic named Morobo, just across the street from the demolished shops I described in the opening. While most signs in the area have either some spelling variant of Tongping or Juba Nabari, the Morobo Clinic sign designates it as the Juba Nabari Tongping branch. It seems to me that the sign acknowledges an undeniable multiplicity while quietly offering a form of reconciliation. As in the sign, both names would continue to rest in the neighborhood as it grew, mixed, and changed. Choosing between them would confine the area to something too unidimensional. It would presume a singular history while denying the open-ended reality of space, and urban space especially. So in discussing how Tongping became Juba Nabari by way of Tongping, I'm suggesting that placemaking is central to imagining and making the South Sudanese state and its future. This suggests just how much is at stake in naming and placemaking in cities impacted by conflict. Memory-linked and future-inflected names express distinct experiences of the city. They make space for newly arrived people and expand the claims of longer settled ones. It would be too simple to read these varied narratives and namings as reflective of inherent opposition, however. They transform moments of conflict into opportunities for building lives and engaging in community and mutual co-creation. They demonstrate the inherently dialogic rather than dialectical, that is, in conversation rather than as in opposition, reworking of cities. As acts of post-state state-making, these actions refuse to concede to simple or top-down definitions of Juba. They push past historic definitions of it to render their own stories and expectations onto it, making it something that belongs more fully to a wider swath of members of the newly political community. In pushing back against the erasures and disorientations wrought by conflict, these actions and enactments multiply meanings and possibilities rather than allowing them to be subsumed under a singular hegemonic plan or a top-down nationalist teleology. In cities undergoing vast political change like Juba, urbanites' discursive strategies and aspirational actions maintain the city as an open-ended process and a generative terrain through which people can build and rebuild their lives and their worlds. So thank you. And this is where I got my funding from.
Thank you. Thank you. Extremely enlightening and exciting story. I have a couple of questions, if you allow me.
Absolutely. Of course.
Well, again, I myself know very little about South Sudan. Kind of mostly, well, I've been following news about kind of Sudan, capital city, its former dictator, General Bashir, right?
Right, absolutely.
The war with the South. But again, it was kind of a revelation to find out from your narrative that South Sudan has been independent since 2011. So for quite some time, So it's like 20 years junior than Ukraine. So kind of an interesting comparison. And again, thanks for providing this economic background, because again, it's interesting to look at oil-rich country, which is really impoverished. As far as I understand, and as far as I know, South Sudan has one of the lowest GDPs per capita. Am I right? So, being oil-rich, being resource-rich, kind of does not imply that the country is wealthy. In fact, it's totally the opposite. And again, thanks for enlightening us on dependency, on continuing dependence of South Sudan from Sudan due to location of all the refineries and these pipes transporting oil to other countries, to other nations. But a couple of kind of general questions. First of all, what is the lingua franca there? And what is the difference in terms of lingua franca being spoken by local people in Sudan, kind of bigger Sudan and South Sudan? I would think that South Sudan is kind of Arab speaking. Am I wrong? Or does it have, or is it relevant at least somehow?
I don't know if do you want me to answer that, and then you can ask.
Yeah.
So officially, the national language of South Sudan is English, so there's this interesting, as I kind of quickly gloss through the decades of history at the start, the formal education that existed kind of historically in South Sudan was coming from European, mainly British missionaries, right? So people who went to school within South Sudan, formal schooling, locally in like a large town from probably the 50s, 60s onwards, would have studied English. But but there's kind of a complication there, right? So there's formally the official language is English, but anyone who the schooling and the language most people speak that is not their native language is Arabic because of the influence of the North, right? Because the northern government was in Arabic, and also because most people who went to school up to the university level, if they didn't go to Europe or to the United States, they went to the Middle East, right? So a lot of them went to school in Cairo or within the region, right? So you have a lot of people who speak, including the president, speak Arabic more fluently than they speak English, but English is the kind of all the government documents and everything are in English. So but there's also a separation because there's a lot of people who were displaced who didn't go north to the Middle East, but went to Kenya or Uganda, which are English speaking. And so if you went to university in Uganda, Kenya, you learned English, right? And this became a problem when I went there in South Sudan. I worked at the university, the National University in Juba, and they were actually having to do this. The professors had taught in Khartoum. They had relocated the university to Khartoum during the war. They now brought it back to Juba, and they wanted basically overnight all of the instructors to switch from teaching in Arabic, which they had been taught in, had done their doctorates in, had been writing in for, decades. They wanted to overnight now start offering all your lectures in English, right? So it's a huge problem because there was this desire to kind of break from the North, break from that region. But logistically, students who had studied in Arabic, teachers who had taught in Arabic, even if they were fluent in English, couldn't overnight make a switch. So there was a bit of tension, and they've now sort of moved forward a bit, and they kind of what they basically did was they grandfathered in, they let students finish in Arabic. But so officially it's English, but if you were to be in Cuba, you would hear English, you would hear a lot of Arabic, you would hear local languages as well. As an ethnographer, there's a challenge. You end up relying a lot on interpreters because as I speak one language from the region, but I don't speak. I know a couple words of Arabic, but I certainly don't speak the multiple languages that I would have to know to speak to everyone who's in the national capital. So yeah, so it's actually a very interesting question. So officially English, I would say, but it's complicated.
It is indeed. So, school students study in English at school, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
And what language do they speak home? Like Arabic, and you mentioned Dinka.
Dinka, Bari. I mean, local languages which people wouldn't be formally taught in necessarily, especially in the secondary level, but English, Arabic, depending on their background. But mostly people speak their local kind of dialect, that their local language at home, and then know English or Arabic or both beyond that. Yeah.
And what's the reason for lack of schooling in local languages? Lack of cadre, lack of resources, or it's kind of ideology behind it?
Right. Yeah. There's been kind of a mixed curriculum situation there where there wasn't a united like universal curriculum across the country in the past. So you just kind of had patchwork experiences and patchwork sort of systems. I think there's been a push in some parts of Africa to have formal schooling in local languages, but I think people see formal education as an opportunity to learn these. Well, we should keep in mind our foreign languages, right? English and Arabic are foreign languages to people who are who grew up with another language because it gives them access to work and jobs and sort of economic opportunities as a result. So people really desire that training as a way to kind of be more engaged and marketable. But certainly I think in sort of in primary schooling often is in they'll kind of mix local language for teaching concepts and then like kind of train students in English as they go forward. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. And is my understanding correct that kind of Dinka is kind of one of the biggest minorities, and it was Dinka tribes or kind of Dinka ethnic group fighting against the domination of the North, of the North?
Yeah, the Dinka are the largest ethnic group, and the Nuer are the second largest. And culturally, kind of historically, they're quite united. There's a lot of similarities in the language, the regions. There's a lot of intermarriage, so it's not as stark as a division as sometimes gets stirred up in conflict. But definitely the Second Sudanese Civil War, the leadership structure was headed by a lot of Dinkas and Nuers. So. And that creates a sense, kind of what I was talking about, that regional difference, right? That like people in Juba who are from Juba feeling like, oh, these new government officers, these veterans are not from here, right? There, because there was a sense that even though they were South Sudanese, they were fighting for national independence, that they're from this other region in a lot of ways, right? That the government and the army is dominated by those ethnic groups. Now, it's not entirely them, but there was definitely a historic kind of like, uh, majority of people from that region within the movement, which was different. Actually, the earlier movement came from a different part of the country and had a different sort of makeup. So yeah, it's complicated. But the Dinka ethnic group is the largest, and it's certainly the president is Dinka. So there's definitely a sense of in opposition to an idea of that they are the majority of people and kind of taking control. But that's also, as I kind of tried to suggest, there's a kind of conflation of anyone who's not from Juba or anyone from not this region as from the Dinka, as ethnically Dinka. But it's not always so simple as that, right? There's actually a lot of competition and conflict among members of the government of the same ethnic background, right? Or from different regions, but from the same ethnic background, right? So, yeah.
And you speak Dinka yourself, right?
I learned a little bit of Dinka. I speak Acholi, which because I lived in northern Uganda for a while. So Acholi is spoken in kind of eastern. This is the complication for an ethnographer is you can know one language and then you know one language, especially languages that are tonal and aren't formally taught in universities. So it becomes a tricky to start to learn. But I learned some Dinka, and it's related to the language I knew already. So structurally, it was similar. So that helped, but challenging.
And what kind of writing system do these languages employ, based on Arabic or English?
No, the formal version is they write in with sort of the English characters, kind of like what the way I put it there. That but they because it's because it's a tonal language, they use these kind of markers. Like I had, you saw I had that O with the two dots. So there's like linguistic markers to kind of reflect it. So it's been transcribed that way, but it's really exists largely as an oral language. People who speak it don't necessarily write it often, right? Or they transcribe it. It's not consistently transcribed. So that's why actually you'll see words written and they're written out in Arabic or they're written out in English, but they're not always written the same way, right? And that's why it's interesting when I said like Dongping versus Dongping, which sounds the same if you're not a native speaker, right? Ends up being kind of conflated and but actually the difference in what they mean and what they evoke and the history there is like couldn't be starker, right? So it's basically our place versus empty.
Two last questions, because I don't
Yeah,
want
for
to
sure.
abuse my position as someone who has come up with questions first. So don't want to monopolize this privilege. So basically, there is no media, mass media, and printed literature in local languages. Media and literature are in English and Arabic.
Yes. Yeah, I would say that's right. Yeah. Yeah, you would find if you newspapers, local media, there are some attempts to there's literature I would say there's an oral literature, there's some literature that exists, but I would say yeah, you would find the media exists really in Arabic and English
Does it
predominantly.
generate any kind of any tension, any strain that kind of local languages aren't represented at this level?
It's interesting. I think that if yeah, I mean I think that there's so many that it would if there was like a dominant say Bari literature written in Bari, it might almost I don't know, it's interesting. I think your audience would be limited, and there's not been, as far as I know, there's not been a move like you could look at if you've ever looked at the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, right? Like for a period, made a point of not writing in English and writing in his native tongue, and writing all of his novels in that way. It was a deliberate attempt to like push away from being part of like a Western literature, but I don't, as far as I know that that doesn't really exist in South Sudan, and I don't know that there's been a push as much for that. I think if anything, it's maybe a tension over like should as their second language or as the language that's not their native language to learn, should it be English or Arabic? I think that's been more the tension than to kind of make local languages more have more of a presence in the media. But I think you would probably see it more in uh, dance, uh, celebrations of culture always would have like native language songs and celebrations, right? You would see that at things. So there's definitely a desire to do that, but not in a written form. I don't know if that answers your question really, but yeah, it's not a source of tension to not have that formal, sort of written literature in local languages, but definitely, yeah, there's an attempt to uh, have those certainly oral traditions, oral languages, oral and songs from different areas be kind of a presence at all kinds of events.
Last question for today.
Yeah, for sure.
Was it safe for you to be there?
I mean, I always felt safe where I was and with the people I was connected with. In Juba, there was some intermittent fighting during some moments, but it was always very like confined to like there were skirmishes between different army factions, and it kind of happened within their compounds. And some of the other events that happened were where that led people to want to live in the UN camps. Some of that happened when I wasn't there. Like the violence that happened, part of the reason Juba made a lot of sense as a place to do field work was I knew I could always go back, and I knew it was like a relatively like accessible place. But certainly other parts of the country I wouldn't have felt as safe going to. But Juba I always felt safe, and I think I also had enough, good friends who were were very invested in talking to me and knew about my project, and I had like long-term relationships with, were always pretty upfront with me about what they thought was a good and a bad idea in terms of like places to go and things to do. So that was, that was the key thing for me, was like if they didn't think something was a good idea, then it was fine. Then I listened, but I never personally felt unsafe certainly in Juba or the other areas I went to.
Right. Thank you. Okay, colleagues,
Yeah.
More questions, comments, debates? Well, I think we've got a lot of food for thought. Perhaps we need to process the knowledge, the information you've provided us with, and we'll be more kind of active and proactive tomorrow. And as far as I understand, tomorrow you are going to be focusing more on your research methods, on data collection, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
That's going to be marvelous. Well, friends, if there are no questions, let me express my gratitude on behalf of Department of Sociology, our School of Sociology and Law, and I dare to say Kiev Polytechnic Institute, university community, to Kristіан for his amusing, enlightening, and extremely vivacious presentation. It's really, I remember reading a book review published in American Sociological Review, and there was the following line there: the book is choke full of insights. So the presentation was choke full of insights and revelations, extremely rich. It reminded me of this Clifford Geertz classic notion of thick description. So it's an extremely thick description, at the same time easily accessible for audience abysmally ignorant about Africa in general and South Sudan in particular. So thanks again, and we are really looking forward to continuing tomorrow.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you'll share my email. Anyone who wants to be in touch in between or afterward, I'm happy to continue the conversation. Absolutely. So
I will. I certainly will, and thanks for your permission.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm going to abuse that privilege.
Perfect. Thank you. No, really an honor to talk to you, and I look forward to chatting to you as well. And perfect.
Yep. Same place, same time.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
And
You as
colleagues,
well.
Have